Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 9th of December 2020. And in this programme today, we'll be discussing what is behind the rise of Islamist attacks across France. And is France heading for an Islamic insurgency? And it could come here. So it's just to remind you that we are live, we are interactive tonight, and we'd love to know your views and your opinions on what's happening in France. Regan, it's good you can join me tonight. It's good to have you back. How's your week been?
It's been a very good week, very productive. Pretty busy, church stuff, very active, getting ready for Christmas and everything, so very exciting times.
Absolutely. And the reason I chose this subject today is I was just looking through some of the major stories, trying to find a kind of big story of the week. And I was astonished by an article that I read in the Daily Mail in the international section, which effectively said that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, had come out and attacked Macron, and essentially saying that how dare a fellow member of NATO and also a nation that wants to be a member of the European Union come out and attack another NATO member such as Macron. So because of his reaction to what only could be described as a huge wave of Islamic attacks that started in October this autumn, with the awful beheading of the Parisian school teacher for showing to his class the horrific cartoon called Charlie Hebdo, and having seen a copy of Charlie Hebdo, it is offensive. It is offensive to Muslims. It is offensive to Christians and everyone else. There's this absolute hatred for any form of religion whatsoever across that magazine, but that never ever justifies the right to actually kill someone and behead someone. So then that has released almost essentially a kind of rise of Islamic insurgency across France, and France could be on the tipping edge.
Well, what we've been seeing this year is so much has been swamped out by COVID-19 news of the vaccines, and so we kind of have been missing out on the stories that have actually been there and kind of being pushed to the side. This has been a problem, as we know, for many years across Europe that we've seen. Even in the UK, some years ago, we saw a spate of attacks. I believe 2017 was particularly difficult, 2016, 2017. And we should recognize that we're by no means beyond such an insurgency of attacks coming back. Across Europe, we've seen isolated Lone Ranger attacks over the years, and we're at a place of societal instability, in large part due to some of the consequences of COVID-19, that we've really created an atmosphere that's ripe for such an attack to go unnoticed. Police forces, defense forces being directed elsewhere to facilitating COVID testing, vaccines, enforcement of guidelines, perhaps taking their eye off of other concerns, which is problematic. But remember, viewers, we're asking this question this evening. Is France headed for an Islamic insurgency, and could this happen here as well? We're live and interactive. Do be sending us some emails and texts.
Yeah. So let's give a bit of a kind of context to what we're talking about tonight. Regan, I mean, firstly, France is experiencing a wave of Islamist terrorism and violence that other Western nations are not facing. Also, we've seen that Macron has raised the terror levels to maximum level emergency. He has deployed 40,000 military personnel to protect schools, churches, and other places of worship. And the latest round of terror attacks, as I said, started when the French Republic started on the 16th of October this year, when history teacher Samuel Paty was beheaded by an 18-year-old Chechen Muslim who only just got his right to actually live in France only a few months earlier. And then we've seen the attack. There was a decapitation,
yes,
I think, at the church at Notre Dame in Nice, and 3 other people were murdered, and several other people injured as well, and loads of other crime-related instances going on that haven't been reported. And the danger is what we face. Our media is so preoccupied by COVID-19, now by the vaccine, that some of the major news stories that we're seeing across the continent are not being reported. And this is why I think we need to report of what's happening in France, because we could see that France could become the first nation, Western nation, to face an Islamic insurgency. And this not only poses a threat to France, but also poses a direct threat to Western security. And yet no of the major newspapers or media outlets are really picking up on what I think is an extremely big story. Plus, we've seen that President Macron has come out with a 5-pointed plan in order to reform France and stop the wave of Islamism across the country. I mean, he's even come up with the idea of a reformed Islam he's proposing, or enlightened Islam, or a French version of Islam, which has not gone down at all well in the Middle East, certainly not with President Erdogan, who's described that he's actually lost his mind. So I think what we're seeing now could just be the tip of the iceberg for something horrific. And even President Macron, in defending secular France, has essentially said that Islamic separatism poses an existential threat to France, which is extraordinary, considering how many Islamic migrants that France allowed in with a big migrant crisis back in 2015.
Total change of tune as well from Macron, because prior to becoming the president, we see that he was actually quite positive towards the immigration, so as an economic opportunity. We have in France a population that is at least 10% made up of Muslims, perhaps even more due to the reality of illegal immigration. That's expected to double within the next generation. Could be even more than that. But if we consider the situation as it stands at the moment, we now have a Western nation that has sent 4,000 military personnel on the streets to protect schools, children, churches, and other public places. Military personnel, not police, not average security. Military personnel to protect churches, schools, and other such public places as a direct result of this perceived and very real threat of Islamic terrorism. What we have to recognize when Macron acknowledges the problem of Islamist terrorism is that there's a legitimate concern. We have to assess the ideology, but what I don't think Macron has understood, and I don't think many in our increasingly pluralistic, multicultural Western civilization understand, is that we cannot force Western ideology on Islamic ideology. We cannot expect Islamic ideology to adapt to some quasi-Christian type ethic in practice. So whether Macron recognizes it or not, what he desires for Islam is a reformation. He desires something to change that makes Islam look more Christian, and it's more compatible as well with the French ideals of enlightenment that come out of the philosophical movement. If we look at France since that time, we see a secular society, a fairly atheist society. A society that's led to publications like Charlie Hebdo, which are reprehensible publications. I remember some years ago, after the 12 members of their staff were murdered by Islamic terrorists, looking at some of the cartoons, and I just immediately closed it because they truly are vile cartoons And I can understand why Muslims would be absolutely horrified, as you and I would be horrified if someone was to do that.
Well, they attack Jesus as well.
Well, they do. They do.
They mock Jesus as well on the cross and other things, seeing that, and they are horrific.
And the thing is, if we look at the difference in response, you know, we look at it and say, that's horrible. Christians should not read that publication. No one should read it. But we recognize the freedom to publish something that reprehensible. Muslims, according to their ideology, if you go to the Quran and the Hadith, you see very clearly this is a direct assault on Islam, and Islam must be defended. And so the acts committed against the staff of Charlie Hebdo and this teacher are consistent with Islam's teachings.
But that's where we have a clash, you know, a huge clash between the ideals of Islamic extremism and secular humanism. Have we got any emails coming through?
Yes, yes, we have one. Hi guys, what you're talking about is part of the next jihad, the takeover of Islam across the world, including the millions that came across Europe over the last few years. And what happened in France will happen here in the UK. So I think that's, we can look at it and say, certainly we don't know what's going to happen, but we have to recognize, even in the past few months here, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have moved the terror alert to just one below the maximum, even in the UK. So we're not that far behind France.
I think we are quite far behind France. If you actually see what's happening in France, you realise that we are probably 3 or 4 years behind what's happening in France, because essentially what France is becoming is a clash of civilizations, a clash between secular French humanism and Islamic extremism. And Islam is the second most dominant religion within France. And also essentially what we're seeing is that there are 150 no-go areas run by Islamic extremism in France itself. But we have to really stop, where does this insurgency that we're seeing now and the latest terrorist attacks, beheadings, all come from? It really all started in 2001 during the Second Intifada, when it was a French TV crew that broadcast the alleged killing of Mohammed al-Dura at that checkpoint in Israel, on the checkpoint in Gaza, in which it was found that Israel was not responsible for the attack, and it very much looked like the Palestinian security forces actually killed Mohammed al-Dura and shot his father, which then became the figure of the Second Intifada. And this is what provoked the outpouring of anger by the Muslim communities in France, and this is by attacking the Jewish community. And since then, we've seen a massive wave of hatred being directed against the Jewish communities. We've seen the ISIS Islamists, I think around 2012, actually shoot a Jewish rabbi and his family in cold blood going to a Jewish school. There's been attacks on the Jewish community. And then what we saw was the attack on Charlie Hebdo. But when we saw the attack on the Charlie Hebdo headquarters, those ISIS terrorists also then decided to attack the Jewish kosher supermarket, which we'll show later. But for an understanding of where we are in terms of what's happening in France, let's go and have a look now at a news report put out by Dale Hurd of CBN that is 10 years old, and we'll have a reflection of what happened then compared to what's happening now.
This is a Friday in Paris, filmed by hidden camera. The streets are blocked by a huge crowd of Muslim worshippers, and it's enforced by private security. This is all illegal in France: the public worship, the blocked streets, and the private security. But the police have been ordered not to intervene. It shows that even though some in the French government want to get tough with the Muslims and ban the burqa, other parts of the French government continue to give Islam privileged status. An ordinary French citizen who was watching the Islamization of Paris decided that the world needed to see what was happening to his city. So he bought a hidden camera and started posting the videos on YouTube. His life has been threatened, and so we're concealing his identity. He uses the alias of Maxime Lepant.
They are blocking the streets with barriers. They are praying on the ground, and the inhabitants of this district cannot leave their home nor go into their home during those prayers. The Muslims who are taking over those streets do not have any authorization. They do not go to the police headquarters, so it's completely illegal.
These Muslims have been granted unofficial rights that no Christian group is likely to get under France's laïcité or secularism law.
So it says people have the right to share any belief they want, any religion, but they have to practice at home or in the mosque, synagogues, churches, and so on.
Some say these Muslims must pray in the street because they need a larger mosque, but Maxime has observed cars coming from other parts of Paris, and he believes it's a weekly display of Muslim power.
They are coming there to show that they can take over some French streets, to show that they can conquer a part of the French territory.
If France faces an Islamic future, it took a Russian to write about it. It's the best-selling novel The Mosque of Notre Dame, 2048, a bestseller in Russia, not in France. The French publisher Jean Robin says the French media ignored the book for being politically incorrect.
So Islam is seen as the religion of the poor people. And so you can't say to the poor people, you're wrong, otherwise you're a fascist. That's how it goes.
The book lays out a dark future when France has become a Muslim nation and the famous cathedral has been turned into a mosque. Whether that plot is far-fetched depends on whom you ask. Muslims are said to be no more than 10% of the French population, although no one knows for sure because French law prohibits population counts by religion. But the birth rate for Muslims is significantly higher than for native French. Some Muslim men are said to practice polygamy, a charge this man faced, in some cases with each extra wife having children and collecting a welfare check.
With Islam, it's not only a problem of numbers. The problem of Islam is a problem of really principles. Is Islam a political ideology or is it just a creed?
French philosopher Radu Stănescu is an Islamic expert who debates Muslim leaders on French TV.
It doesn't matter how many they are. The problem is the people who follow Islam are there somehow in a political party who has a political agenda, which means basically implementing Sharia and build an Islamic state.
From the 1980s until just recently, it was a social taboo to criticize or oppose Islam, and so the government and media effectively helped Islam spread throughout the country.
We were expecting Islam to adapt to France. Now it's France adapting itself to Islam.
About the veil, this Muslim says Europeans should respect Muslim dress. This woman says the veil is in the Quran, and we only submit to God and nobody else. Even if many government elites in France are in denial over Islam, the people in the streets increasingly are not. And they're becoming fed up with what they see as the growing Islamization of this country. They've started staging pork and wine aperitifs or cocktail parties in the street. They're patriotic demonstrations meant to strike back against Islam. Another national demonstration is planned for this Saturday. It looks as if a public backlash against Islam has begun. The French Parliament will debate a new burqa law this month. And this French leader has a warning for the West and for America.
We cannot accept the development of such practice because it's not compatible with the life in a modern society, you see? And this question is not only a French question. You will all have to face this challenge.
Dale Hurd, CBN News, Paris.
And it's extraordinary to think that that excellent report by Dale Hurd was 10 years old, and so much has happened in France since then. What's interesting as well, I think if we go back to the time of 2014, 2015, because I think this was a key moment in French history, and that was that Israel was involved in that war against Hamas in Gaza of 2014, in which Hamas paralyzed 2/3 of Israel, firing rockets and missiles over the country, meaning that Israelis couldn't go out to work. They were hemmed in, which then forced the Israeli government to take military action against Hamas. And I think that was a month offensive, or even maybe 6 weeks. I think it was a month offensive. In which Israel was engaged in military conflict against Hamas, in which Israel faced international condemnation around the world for defending its citizens. But really what we saw in France as well is that the Islamic Arab communities in France started to attack the Jewish communities in France. So we saw massive protest, Jewish shops being destroyed and burnt down, Jewish people being attacked, synagogues set alight. And then we started to see a large exodus of French Jews to Israel and the States. That was then followed by the fact that Hollande was president, and that Hollande, as president, carried out the most anti-Israel policies of anyone in the Western world, and was pushing for a Palestinian state. And what was so interesting, back on the 27th of December 2014, it was Hollande and the French government led a UN resolution to recognise a unilateral Palestinian state. In less than 10 days, France was hit by the Charlie Hebdo terror attack, and the attack on the Jewish kosher supermarket. And then, of course, then we saw in November, I think, was it 2016 or 2015? The horrendous terrorist attack in Paris, the Bataclan.
Yeah.
I think over 500 people were actually murdered in that terror attack, and
it was horrifying.
Absolutely horrific what happened there. So what really happened spiritually is that France was having developing the most anti-Israel policies of anyone in the Western world. So that same terror and fear that came on Israel came to France, and that same spirit.
What we see definitely is the Islamic ideology of holy war, spoken of 109 times in the Quran, attested to throughout the Hadith, being enacted in what is seen as a fundamentally immoral, secular state. France has, for centuries, prided itself on its lack of affiliation, formally and politically, to any religion. Yes, Roman Catholic ideology, belief is very heavy still in France, yet the fundamental rootings of its society and how it operates are secular. And so the Islamic ideology that clashes with that, even more so when you have attempts to try and claim, as Macron has done, that Islam should be reformed and that it's in crisis. There's nothing new with Islam. This is nothing new. You can go all of the way back to the 8th century and you see that there was this battle of the Moors seeking to take over France, as they had already advanced through so many different places already, had taken large parts of Spain, but Charles Martel was able to hinder that from happening. So this conflict, it's been on and off, it's been ongoing. It's all a part, even as the video was showing on the spiritual level, Islamic domination. And we have to understand that while we have sure and certain hope of Christ's full and final triumphant victory over all of the forces on this earth, we have to have eyes open to the reality that this is what Islam is fundamentally about.
And also, I think we have to really identify ideologies that at their very heart are based on Jew hatred.
Oh, we have some emails coming in here. Thank you, Les. If a country like France turns its back on the God of the Bible, sooner or later another God is going to try to fill that vacuum. How is a secular country going to deal with spiritual forces? And you know how militant Islam is. Well put, Les. Here we have from Norma. Hi, guys. She speaks about how if there can't be any control within Islam, then we, the West, should not allow them into our Western countries. Did you see the Jerry Springer show? It was disgusting. I've never seen the cartoon. Speaking of Charlie Hebdo, I believe, I'm convinced it can't be as bad as Jerry Springer taking the make out of Christianity. I think
That's
it was,
on the same par.
yeah, it's on the same par. Why are we allowing Muslims to rule our Western countries? That's not happened yet, but we're talking about whether or not that could happen. The Quran does not insist on women being covered, only dressed modestly and not to draw attention to themselves, which by wearing total covering, they're very much drawing attention to themselves. You know, one thing, Norma, that I would say we have to be very careful about here. As Christians, we do respect all people. We seek to honor all people. We seek to value and respect the freedom to hold certain beliefs and practice in certain ways other than our own. We don't participate in acts of violence or anything like that. We have to make a clear distinction between those who are committing acts of terror and those who are endorsing acts of terror and the ideology of it. We have to talk about illegal immigration. We have to talk about legal immigration. It's a very complicated issue here. What we need to make clear is that we should actively show Christ's love to our Muslim neighbor, calling them to the one and only true way, which is in Jesus Christ, while recognizing that there are dangers associated with this obvious and intended onslaught of Islamic ideology. Thank you for that interaction, Norma. Yeah, that's it. Please keep sending more texts and emails.
Excellent. I'm just going to read out what President Macron said recently. He said that secularism is the glue of a united France. Islamists are pursuing a conscious, theorized, political, religious project that holds Islamic laws to be superior to those of the Republic and spurs Muslims, in effect, to shun mainstream society. He also said that Islam is in crisis and warned the danger of those who propose to create the Islamic Caliphate, and that Islamic separation has grown because of the cowardice of French authorities. We also, I think, have to take into account the political realities of what's happening in France as well, because Macron in 2020 faces another French presidential election. He knows that Marine Le Pen is waiting in the wings with a lot stronger, tougher action that she proposes to take on tackling the rise of Islamic extremism within France. We know that she's associated with the far right, and it's even been aligned with President Putin in Russia as well. So we know that this is pretty scary, because I think what we're seeing essentially not only is a rise of Islamic extremism across Europe, but also an extreme right-wing backlash against it. And it wouldn't surprise me in the next 5 or 6 years if we see the rise of Nazi-type ideology to actually counter the rise of Islamic extremism across Europe. And this is what happens. This is what happens in the spiritual vacuum that we're in. And this is, I think, as a backlash and a consequence to that. But ultimately, these two ideologies, even though they would appear that they have nothing in common, what is at the center of their ideology is hatred of the Jewish people. And where that becomes the center of the ideology, you can see those two forces eventually coming together at some point, because they have such a shared interest, which is frightening, which could fulfill prophecies in Jeremiah that talks about how the Lord will send out the hunters. First send out the fishermen to bring the Jewish people home, and then the hunters. So we could be seeing an extension of the season of hunters to get the Jewish people out of Europe, because Europe is no longer that safe for the Jewish people. I'm going to show you now an extract of a documentary that we made back in 2015 that was aired in 2016 called Jew Hatred, A Warning from History. And this is me interviewing Dr. Glenn Feder, who's a security expert, actually at the hypermarket where the ISIS terrorist attack took place in Paris back in January of 2015. On the eve of the Jewish Shabbat, Friday the 9th of January 2015, a lone ISIS terrorist stormed into the Jewish kosher supermarket in downtown Paris and murdered 4 Jewish shoppers in cold blood. This shocking attack, which happened just 2 days after the attack on the Charlie Hebdo offices, caused outrage and shock amongst the French Jewish community and around the world, and raised several important questions as to the main reasons for this atrocity. We are on our way to meet Dr. Glenn Feder, a security expert, to discuss the impact this terrorist attack had on the Jewish community. Glenn, it's good to meet up with you. I mean, behind us here we have the kosher supermarket that was attacked horrifically by Islamic State. What was the impact not only on the Jewish community here in Paris, but around the world?
There was a march afterwards which mobilized, some think, the largest amount of people ever in French history for a demonstration. Many world leaders joined in this march. Some were absent as well, noticeably like Barack Obama. But ultimately, I think the world mobilized, came here, and stood against this attack, and stood against, of course, the Charlie Hebdo attack.
And we can see that the hypermarket is open today. Doesn't this say something about the Jewish spirit, that despite attacks and atrocities, Jewish people want to rebuild their lives and actually prove to the terrorists, you can't beat us because we're still living?
Yeah. Well, I think it shows an incredible resilience, and it also sends a message that these types of attacks will never stop Jews and other citizens from living their lives. But at the same time, we can't ignore that it's taken a hard toll on the community. As we know, there is a high number of Jews that are leaving France now, and a lot of it has to do with incidents like this. They're scared and they don't see themselves building a serious future in France anymore.
And I enjoyed very much making that documentary called Jew Hatred, A Warning from History, looking at the ISIS terrorist attacks that took place in France and Belgium over 2014 and 2015. Just a reminder, we are live, we are interactive tonight, and love to know your views and your opinions. Are the insurgency that we're seeing across the channel in France, could it happen here? Please give your thoughts, because we'd love to hear from you, and we are live, we are interactive. Because I've been travelling, so I haven't this year because of COVID-19, but travelling to Brussels, recording a programme in the European Parliament, the European Report, seeing Belgium soldiers and paratroopers defending Jewish synagogues, defending the European Parliament, defending schools is nothing new or nothing strange. Even when we were filming the documentary made in Paris, we would see French paratroopers walking around with machine guns defending the Jewish community in fear of those kind of ISIS attacks. I mean, thanks to President Trump, ISIS as an organization that's based in Syria and Iraq with their Islamic caliphate has effectively been destroyed. But that doesn't mean to say that this ideology has been destroyed. And what we could find is in the next couple of years that this will metamorphose into another Islamic terrorist group that then carries out terrorist attacks across France. And also what makes it so difficult in France to counter this is the Schengen border. The open borders. And even Macron has questioned the effectiveness of the Schengen borders. I don't know if have you seen that film that came out, was produced by, who's it produced by?
What's it about?
Clint Eastwood.
Clint Eastwood.
It was a whole film about these American soldiers.
Oh, yes. It's lost on me.
Amsterdam to Paris or something. Paris to
yes,
Amsterdam.
the story on the Euro.
Yeah. On the Eurostar, yeah.
I did not see that. I believe my brother saw that though, and said it covered exactly what happened, you know, as it was recorded in the newspapers. I remember when that occurred and thought it's a rather incredible story. But
3:15 to Paris. 15:17 to Paris. Thanks, Luke. Glad someone's on the ball tonight. No, it was an incredible film because the actors were actually, they played themselves. So those soldiers played themselves, and they're just going on a trip to Europe, and they wanted to go to Germany, and they stayed off in Amsterdam. And then they were on board that train that went from Amsterdam to Paris. And I've been on that train, and so I know exactly where it is. It stops over in Brussels. And the terrorists got on board on Brussels and then had 2 guns and was going to carry out an absolute massacre on that train. But, you know, the bravery of these American soldiers
we're talking
into their own hands actually prevented a massive terrorist attack.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking a bit before the programme about some of the attacks that we had here in London, and remember there was the 21st of July, I believe. Following that, there was an attempt, I can't remember if it was successful or not, one of the would-be bombers on that occasion trying to escape via the Eurostar. And so, you know, that freedom of movement that's there, you can look at it and say that it creates an environment that makes it very easy to move around with limited surveillance.
Absolutely.
We have quite a few messages coming in now. Thank you to our viewers. Brenda says, good evening. Just to say that President Macron intends to stop homeschooling, hate speech, etc., we must be aware that although he is trying to stop Islamicization, this also will affect all religions, including Christians. That's a very valid point. And, you know, you were just talking there about how the far right gaining power as well. That's not a good thing. That's not a good thing for Christians. That's not a good thing for Jews. But it kind of can create that weird marriage between Islam and the far right that could.
I mean, it happened during the Second World War with Hitler and al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. That Hitler was so impressed with him, he allowed the Grand Mufti al-Husseini to create his own Islamic division of the SS in the Balkans. So it proves that it does work. And also we see the origins of Islamic extremism in the Middle East actually has its origins in Nazism, as it was inspired the kind of Muslim Brotherhood.
This from Anita. Hi, Simon and Regan. Islamic terrorism is one of the most worrying aspects of our day. I had to read The Reluctant Fundamentalist. This book has won awards, and its protagonist is a Muslim who is working in the US during the attack on the Twin Towers. It is quite disturbing, as the man here seems to find pleasure in watching this act. This book was being studied at A level. It worries me that in universities we allow extremists to speak. We're afraid to speak out about Islam or deal more forcefully with the problem in the UK, and as Christians we advocate love towards all, but I do worry about my brother and sister-in-law who work in London, as attacks there are always a worry. The attacks in France were terrible, and there is so much hatred leveled at both Jews and Christians worldwide. God bless you, and thank you for your insightful programs. Indeed, there are quite a few stories that we can see of Islamic extremists speaking in universities rather freely, holding debates, holding discussions at a university that is not too far from myself. I remember encountering a very large contingent of young men who I have great reason to believe had been radicalized and were very much adopting a violent approach to propagating their beliefs. We have also here from Jay, I've just been reading a news story today about one of France's top former generals who says he believes the country is heading towards civil war. A sobering assessment.
Yeah. So can I read out? I think this is really important that after the recent attacks we saw with the death of the beheading of the history teacher, the murder of 3 French citizens at the Notre Dame cathedral in Nice. This is how Macron responded. He's wanting to set up a 5-point programme to confront Islamism in France. The first thing he wants to do is strengthen secularism by consolidating the Republic's principles. Public services will no longer agree to give special concessions to Muslims. He goes on to say, for example, no separate swimming times for Muslim women and no tolerance for Muslim bus drivers who turn away immodestly dressed female passengers. Number 2, athletic, cultural and artistic and other associations will be stripped of any hint of Islamic indoctrination. Number 3, secularism will be more strongly emphasised in schools and Muslim parents will no longer be able to pull their children out of music or swimming classes. In the Islamic communities is considered not haram. Schools will be compulsory for everyone over the age of 3 and foreign interference will be forbidden. Point 4, the French government is to establish the formation of an Islamic enlightenment, i.e. a French version of Islam, development of a high-level Islamic studies in universities and the establishment of an Institute of Islamic Ology. Number 5, disaffective Muslims will be encouraged to appreciate, even love the Republic, a task that will oblige French leaders to carry out a request. In reference to the Spanish Reconquistas, the series of medieval military actions taken out. It says let me read this again. So this is a series of medieval military actions, a means of which the Iberian Peninsula was gradually liberated from Muslim occupiers. The government asserted Macron needs to mobilise the nation for a republic awakening. So this is essentially what we've seen here. But the problem within the education system in France is a major problem. I think that Macron is recognising that this is a major problem he's got to tackle for 2 reasons. I think he realises that the French ideals of the Republic, the secular humanist ideals of France, which were founded with the French Revolution of 1789, are under threat. He also sees that Marine Le Pen is coming up in the wings and is gaining polls. And since this speech, Macron's popularity has gone up in the polls. So this is clearly something that the French people are desiring, that the French government takes stronger action to stop the Islamisation of France.
And yet, with regards to the educational element, French Muslim students have routinely expressed total apathy, total disinterest in French history. And so you can understand to a degree how there's a clash of the ideologies. The Enlightenment teachings clash very heavily with Islamic ideology. At the same time, if you're going to be citizen of a particular nation, you do need to appreciate its heritage. You do need to recognize to some extent the background you're living in and the background to the place and have a measure of appreciation for it. They've expressed opposition to studying such topics as monarchy, the Enlightenment, French Revolution, French colonialism, even World War II and the Holocaust, which is interesting. Because there we have, as we were talking about, the hatred of Jews that's been shown, it would seem that there's a desire to not actually focus on that particular event, which probably more than any other event epitomizes and embodies hatred of Jews. Let's just not talk about that. Let's not study it. We don't want to hear about it. Let's sweep that under the carpet. So Macron has a very real challenge with this idea that Islam needs to be reformed. He's not Muslim, so I can understand from the Muslim standpoint, well, who is he? Who is he to tell us what we need to do? Who is he to tell us that we need to reform? At the same time, he is the president of France. And he is in charge of fulfilling his mandate as the president of France to reflect French values, whether or not we agree with those or not. And so there's this real clash of ideologies that, is there an answer?
I'm not sure there is. I think it's gone too far. And I think when we look back at history, and historians will look back at this period of history, certainly since the post-Second World War era, there is one issue or policies that have been put in place into legislation across Western Europe, and that's the issue of abortion. And if it wasn't for abortion, then there wouldn't be a need for mass immigration to actually create the jobs that were needed to keep and sustain the country. But before, I think we've got 3 minutes left of the programme, Regan, but also want to talk about the fact how, for example, the Turkish President Erdogan is leading a Muslim campaign against Macron, effectively calling for economic boycotts on French goods. So here we see that President Macron's also intervened very much in the conflict in Armenia against Azerbaijan, taking and supporting Armenia as well. And so we're seeing here a big clash between Turkey and France.
Yeah, and the president of Turkey has actually said that Macron needs mental health checks.
Yep.
He needs his brain tested or something. There's been calls for boycotts of French goods by Muslim countries. And remember, there are quite a few countries that are predominantly Muslim that have a colonial past. So there's a good measure of French goods that would be...
Algeria, for example, Tunisia.
Morocco.
Former colonies in North Africa.
So this growing diplomatic standoff between France and Turkey, fellow NATO members, is presenting quite a diplomatic crisis. And the solution, I don't know. Closing on this note, though, this is something that we do know. We know that the devil has tried and is trying by any means possible to spread false religion ideology, to stop the return of the Jewish Messiah, Jesus. But we also know that Jesus has the victory and will return. We have the victory in Christ, and the ultimate destination of the devil is the lake of fire. Thank you for that great message to close out on.
Okay. Regan, it's great to be joining you tonight, so thank you for that. And I want to thank you all for watching tonight's Behind the Headlines. What is happening in France is extremely serious and extremely worrying, and the great danger is that this could actually come here. And so I think tonight's programme really is a wake-up call to the threats that we all face from the rise of Islamic extremism. But I want to leave you with an extract of part of the documentary recorded back in 2015, called Jew Hatred, A Warning from History. And this is an interview that I did with the president of the Jewish community in France, warning about the dangers the Jewish community face in the rise of Islamic extremist attack and how this will come to France. So thank you for watching. I'm also saying you can watch the full documentary online as well, and you can see that on YouTube and also our website, Jew Hatred, A Warning from History.
I believe that the rise of the jihad in the world has become a world war. I'm not the first to say it. Pope Francis said it in September 2014 at a delegation of the World Jewish Congress, of which I was part. He said, after the Jews, it's the Christians who are persecuted, expelled from the Middle East, and he also added, we entered into the Third World War. And I believe that he's right. The war between the jihad, between the barbarian methods of cutting heads, of stone throwing on women, of killing kids, this war between these barbarians and the Western world is spreading from the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, to Africa, Mali, Chad, Cameroon, Niger, Nigeria, and it has reached Europe. It has touched France, Belgium, and Denmark, and we are expecting the next attacks. I think it's a world war. between the barbarian Middle East, Middle Ages methods and the Western world. And I believe that the Western leaders are very wrong if they are not really fighting on land to combat this, because it is spreading, it is dangerous for our values and for our future.
What policies would you like to see the French government and that of the European Union introduce in order to combat the growing rise of anti-Semitism in Europe today?
As I said, it's a war, and you don't fight a war without sending soldiers. European population have, after the Second World War, decided to create Europe with the idea that they would become a big, fat, prosperous, neutral Switzerland, and they are not ready to fight. You don't see, apart from the French army in Mali, you don't see any European soldier in any place of the world fighting against the jihad, and the jihad is fighting against us. It's a one-sided war, and we have to wake up.
Do you have a message for our Western leaders when it comes to the issue of anti-Semitism, that failure to tackle anti-Semitism only then leads to greater terrorism and greater violence to other populations and other countries?
Well, we have to fight this war in all the places where it is developing. I mentioned the ground places in the Middle East, but it has to be fought also on internet. We discovered that Mohamed Merah and Mehdi Nemmouche were trained on internet, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google, and we should not let this area, which is a result of a huge scientific progress, in the hands of hate speech and people who want to destroy us.
And finally, Roger, do you have a message for the Anglo-Jewish community who are very, very concerned with what they're seeing on the continent, and that is a rise of anti-Semitism?
Well, they are very right to be concerned, because it's not reserved. What we suffer today is not reserved to the French Jews, and all the Jews in the world are concerned. And moreover, it's not the problem of the Jews; it's a problem of the Western civilization, of Europe. Europe has to raise and to understand that there is a war which is being developed against our civilization.
It is becoming very apparent that we are facing a very real threat to our Western civilization. France has experienced an unprecedented wave of terrorism that is threatening the French way of life. Islamic extremism is loudly spreading its message of hate and violence against our cherished values of democracy and liberty. Our war is being waged on the multitude of fronts, from the newsroom to the very streets of France, with the Jewish people on the front line in this war. What is happening to the Jewish people today in Europe is a warning of what is to come for the rest of European society. In our next journey, we travel to Brussels, to the heart of the European Union and its institutions, to discover the extent of Jew hatred in Belgium.